I personally think that every flower farmer, every gardener has this one plant that they just can't seem to grow or grow correctly. And for me, that is stock or Matthiola incana. So for those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Jessie. I am a first-year cut flower farmer. 2022 was my first season. I live in New Jersey and I grow in zone 6B. And for whatever reason, I decided I wanted to grow stock. I think it's because when we look at photos of stock, when we read about stock, we see this as this beautiful flower full of heads and just blooms, and it's supposed to have this very sweet yet spicy clovey smell. And having actually successfully grown a few stems, the smell is truly invigorating, and it's just one of those things that really captivated me, and I wanted to grow it. But the problem is stock is not a crop that can be grown in any kind of climate. In fact, stock comes from Europe in the Mediterranean climate. It does really well in a temperate type of environment. So temperate really just means it's a moderate type of environment where you don't have a lot of swings. So if you have 4 seasons, you do not live in a temperate climate. And stock just doesn't like that. So there are times where it just becomes really hard for us to grow things that were not intended to grow in our zone. And that's where protection, high tunnels, supplemental heating, right? Like all that stuff comes into play. And that's why people are able to grow things in zones that they're not able to typically grow those types of plants in. But as a first-year cut flower farmer, as someone who doesn't have a ton of infrastructure, a lot of those things are not necessarily luxuries that I personally benefit from. So what I want to do is I wanted to do a video summarizing my experiences really failing with stock. You'll see what I'm talking about, and some lessons that I've learned, and hopefully they will transfer to you if you're also growing stock in a climate like mine. Let's talk about some stock 101 basics though. So as I mentioned before, stock came from the Mediterranean climate. It does not love the heat. And this is part of the problem because stock loves the sun. It just doesn't love hot temperatures. So the sweet spot here is something between like a 45 and 60 degrees. Now, the other issue with stock is that when your nighttime temperatures start consistently going above 60 degrees, stock will not initiate flowers. I think that sweet spot for stock at night is really like a 55-degree temperature range. And this is also assuming that, your soil has somewhat thawed from the winter or it's not too hot from the summer. So this is why when people talk about temperatures, they talk about nighttime temperatures, because nighttime temperatures really impact what your soil temperature looks like. And when I talk about one of my successions with stock, I'm going to talk about the impact of soil temperature had on stunting the growth of my stock. But just to make sure that you guys are all on the same page, stock is a cool weather hardy annual. It can actually survive down to temperatures of like the mid-20s Fahrenheit. And it overall you should consider it as a cool hardy annual more so than anything else. All right, so what did I grow this year in terms of successions for stock? I had what I call 3 rounds. So my first round was actually my most successful round, meaning I got a few blooms off of that succession. So I started about, I would say 120 from seed. I used Johnny seed. The variety was, it was iron stock. I had both rose and blue. And they were very easy to germinate. They were very easy to soil block. And, they were probably one of the easiest seedlings to start. So I started those in sometime, I would say it was like mid-late February. And I started it a little bit earlier than what the seed packet recommended because I understood that if I started exactly as when the seed packet said I should, I'd actually run out of time because it would start getting too hot where I lived. Now in New Jersey in zone 6B here, I would say that we do get somewhat of a spring and a fall, but it always feels like you have those days in the spring where it is really cold. It feels like winter. They kind of throw off what spring should be, and then all of a sudden you're in the thick of summer where it's hot, it's humid, and cool hardy annuals no longer have a place in the garden. So all that being said, I tend to sometimes start some cool hardy annual seeds earlier than what the seed packet says for that very reason. So I started the seeds in late February and I transplanted them basically, I would say late March, early April. That was mistake number one, because even though these stock had been hardened off by me, the soil temperature in which I planted them in was not ideal. It was still way too cold. And you could tell because the stock leaf growth started getting stunted. And when I say stunted, I mean they were puny. They were just, I mean, it looked like a miniature plant that just kept on going up, but the leaves were just so pathetic looking. And when you look at videos of other people growing stock, they have these lush big leaves, and my stock was not looking like that. And I also know that they got stunted because in round 3, when I planted the same exact stock variety from seed, I got much lush and fuller looking leaves. So soil temperature really matters. You don't want to move them out when it's still too cold outside. The problem is that there's really no real ideal time to move them out. And that kind of brings me to round 2, because I bought plugs from Farmer Bailey's. I bought column stock variety, and they arrived in mid-April. And I still remember the week that they arrived, we had some nighttime temps in the high 20s. And these are seedlings that are coddled in a greenhouse. They really have perfect temperature their entire lives. They have not been hardened off. So even if they were a little bit hardened off, they would still not be able to adapt to that kind of weather extreme of the low 20 or high 20s at night. So I waited a little bit to put them out. In the process, I was hardening off, and I put them out. It was basically the last week of April. So I would say the first couple of weeks, they were acclimating. There was some transplant shock. They were just doing their thing to adjust. And then by the time they adjusted, summer came. It was hot. It got hot. I mean, I remember that by the time they looked like they had finally adjusted, nighttime temperatures were consistently above 60 degrees. And I said to myself, crap, these are probably not going to flower, and they didn't. So around this time, this is late June, my round 1 finally started to flower. So I'll show you some photos over here. They were, I think the best way to describe these stems were they smelled really good, but they were by no means a focal nor even an accent type of flower in a bouquet. They were just like an accessory. They were there. They were more there for the scent than anything else. And that's disappointing because stock really can make a really good accent flower or even be the star of a bouquet if they're lush, but these weren't. And I would say out of the 120 that I grew, I got maybe 15 stems if I had to guess. It was not a lot. And it was also because I completely lost probably about half of those. So 60 transplants in the first phase that I put them out, and then I got more out of the ones that I waited a couple more weeks for the weather to get warmer, put them out. And I think those got put out basically early April, and they definitely they bounce back from their stuntedness from the cold, right? So a lot of this goes to tell you have to be patient and you can't rush things. We had just moved here in March, so there was a part of me where it was just I didn't want to continue to baby the seedlings. I want to just get them out into the ground, and I paid for that. So that was round 1. I got basically 15 stems off of 120, and in my view, they were not even real stems in a bouquet, but they did bring a good scent to them. So round 2 was the plugs. These were the ones that by the time late June came around, I said, crap, they're not going to flower. And then by the time July comes around, it gets really, really hot. But the thing is, these stock are still alive, and they look like they've plateaued in terms of growth, but they certainly are not withering. So I'm thinking to myself, well, I did pay for these plugs. I think I paid $60 for a tray of 200, or actually it might have been less than 200 because the stock plugs come in bigger plug sizes. Anyway, I was like, maybe I can keep them alive till the fall where they have a second chance to flower under the cool weather of fall. So I interplanted sunflowers. I did this by direct seeding some sunflower seeds, but I also transplanted what I called some sacrificial sunflowers. These sacrificial sunflowers actually gave me tall enough blooms eventually for me to put in bouquets. So they weren't necessarily sacrificial, but what they did was they provided a great shade canopy for the stalk. And as you can see over here, the stock actually was able to manage through our hot summers. And, you know, our summers can get pretty hot and humid here. The soil temperature definitely really warms up to a point where it is just not a good environment for stock. But these stocks were troopers and they made it through. So we get to September where it's still hot during the day, but the nighttime temperatures are definitely coming down. And I'm like, there is hope after all. So at this point, I've already harvested all my sunflowers. The stock's getting 6 to 8 hours of sunlight at the minimum, like full on sunlight. And I just keep on looking at the petals and there's nothing. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to show you a video that I took basically an hour ago. So we're in early December. It is December 4th to be exact. And this is what the stock looks like right now. And here we are. This is what they look like. I can't believe they're still standing so upright and almost unaffected by all the cold weather that we've had. I mean, there it is where I just keep on peeling behind and looking to check if there's any blooms, and this one just keeps on growing leaves. I mean, it almost looks like a palm tree. But all of these have been in the ground since April, as I said before, and they're still alive, but they're just not putting on flowers. I'm actually not super sure why. It's almost like they've been stunted and they can't produce flowers, but they can still produce foliage. So that's interesting to me because this is the round 3 succession. These are the ones that were intercropped with the sunflowers, and you can actually see that there are some buds over here. These started forming actually, I would say, in mid-October. So we're in early December. And these just did not hold up well. And if anything, these actually, you can tell there's hoops here. I covered them for a little bit and they still didn't do well. So what that tells me potentially is that the root growth in that other row over there was strong enough for whatever reason to help the plant withstand the low frosts. I mean, we got down to like the teens, like 19 degrees, I think, one day here. And these guys just are like, they're clearly done. So just so strange how these guys started flowering. And, you know, this is kind of like what I would expect that side to look like at this point. So I talked a little bit about my round 3 in the video that I shot outside, but just to give you guys a little bit more detail, I started the seed in cell plug trays back in early August. Again, these were the Johnny iron stock seeds, easy to germinate. They were transplanted in between sunflowers that had already started growing in late August. Now, these sunflowers were only a temporary canopy for them because they were harvested by the second week of September. So you could tell that when the stock got transplanted in, they were a little bit like, they weren't stunted, but they weren't growing at a rate that they should have been because they didn't have enough sunlight. So once those sunflowers got harvested, those leaves started taking off. And there was like, I felt really positive about them because, as I mentioned, I started seeing buds in early October. Now, what ended up happening was I think I covered them a little bit too late. And I covered them with the wrong kind of cover in my view. So there's 2 main types of covers, right? There's plastic and then there's polyester or fabric here. So in this case, I wish I had more of my Agribond or the fabric, and I didn't, so I had to cover them with plastic. So the main difference is that fabric obviously allows sunlight in, but also allows airflow as well as any precipitation that comes in. So it's a lot more set it and forget it versus plastic, which is a much more, like a robust barrier. So although sunlight's getting in, it's not letting really any airflow as well as precipitation get in. So greenhouses use plastic, but greenhouses also have fans. They also have irrigation, right? So there's a lot more of hands-on work that you have to do when it is just full on plastic. And so this was basically greenhouse grade plastic. And when I covered it, it was really, really cold at night, but then there were days where the temperature shot up to like 60 and then came back down. And so there's a lot of fluctuation, and in a perfect environment, I would have gone out and actually uncovered, but life happens. I had a lot of work stuff, so it never happened. I think that also did not help the progress of this stock. So, it ultimately brings me to what would I do differently next year? And this is where I kind of get caught in between, because is one time of year better than the other? Is spring better than fall? And I can't even give an answer right now unless if you can help me in the comments below. But what I mean by this is, if I start them in the spring, what's in my control is I can protect from the cold, but there gets to be a certain point where I can't protect the stock from the heat, right? Like, it's just going to get warmer, and it's not like you can cover. I mean, you could provide some shade cloth, but still at a certain point, it becomes difficult to continue using shade cloth. Like, it's just not going to provide the amount of protection they need from the heat. So you run out of time that way. But then if I am trying to plant these for fall, then I almost run out of time in terms of daylight, because I guess I could start these stock indoors, have them grow during the month of August, get them to a state that gets them to be a bit more mature for September, and then hope that they're going to take off in October. But if they don't, then I'm going to get 10 hours of daylight or less in November, and then it's kind of game over there, right? So my conclusion is that you really kind of need a high tunnel or a very controlled environment to be able to grow these successfully. Now, I would love to hear from you folks who grow stock in a similar zone, in a similar environment, and can prove me wrong on that regard, right? Because the last thing that I'm looking for is to both utilize more time as well as more energy indoors, or even just going outside to uncover all that stuff for stock, right? The easiest thing to do would be to just not plant it because it's not made for my climate, but at the same time it's stock. I just have this belief that I need to grow at least one successful crop before I say goodbye, because I know it is not a financially sound type of crop for me to grow. So drop me some advice in the comments, and hopefully at the minimum, this video helps you when you start growing stock as an inexperienced